Hey guys, welcome to the Judincast. This is for Social Studies 20-1. This is episode 11, where we're going to be talking about the interwar period. So we've covered the four ultranationalist states that we're looking at in this course, and we're now going to be approaching World War II. And the period in between World War I, which ends in 1918, and World War II, which starts in 1939, is known as the interwar period. So let's take a look at that. Before we take a look at that, just a quick review here, because we've talked about two different political systems that you see common amongst ultranational states: fascism, communism. Now, there's a lot of differences between them. What are some of the similarities? What connects them? Well, what you should put down is totalitarian. They're authoritarian. They use force and terror. One-party states. They use control participation. They use scapegoating. And they both ultimately are able to rise through an economic and social crisis. And both of these ideologies are going to have a major impact in the interwar period, because the interwar period is characterized by the rise of a number of authoritarian states around the world. Some are fascist, some are communist. Okay, so the interwar period. Interwar period was a period between the end of the First World War, 1918, beginning of the Second World War, 1939. So 20 years, basically. Despite the relatively short period of time, this period represented an era of significant changes worldwide. It's one of the most transformative periods in world history. So petroleum-based energy production and the associated mechanization of production expanded dramatically, leading to the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties it obviously takes place in the 1920s. It's a period of economic prosperity and growth for the middle class in North America, Europe, and other parts of the world. The birth of consumerism, automobiles, electric lighting, radio broadcast, and more became commonplace among populations in the developed world. But the indulgences of this era were subsequently followed by the Great Depression that we talked about. So, Great Depression starts in 1929 with the collapse of the stock market on Black Tuesday. But from 1920 to 1929, it's a great period of prosperity. It's the Roaring Twenties, birth of consumerism, and a real expansion of mechanization, of mass production, a real harnessing of energy. The Great Depression is an unprecedented worldwide economic downturn which severely damaged many of the world's biggest economies. And this is going to play a role in the solidification of authoritarianism in a number of countries. Politically, this era coincided with the rise of communism, starting in Russia with the October Revolution and finally the Russian Civil War, where communist regime was very much established by 1922, 1923. At the end of World War I, and ended with the rise of fascism in Germany, Italy. These are parts of the interwar period. Germans come to power in the 1930s, Italians early 1920s, the fascists. China was in the midst of a long period of instability and civil war. The empires of Britain, France, and others faced challenges as imperialism was increasingly viewed negatively in Europe, and independent movements in British India, French Indochina, Ireland, and other regions gained momentum. The Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and German empires were dismantled, while the Ottoman and German colonies were redistributed among the Allies, chiefly the United Kingdom and France. The western parts of the Russian Empire, vast empire led by the Tsar, develops into new nation states. You get Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. They become independent sovereign states. So the interwar period is a period of vast change, economic change, political change, social change that's sweeping through a number of countries during this period. And one of the most important events from this period is the Spanish Civil War. Spanish Civil War is kind of a lot of people consider the beginning of World War II. So Spanish Civil War is from 1936 to 1939. Here's Spain here. There was a military revolt against the Republican government, against the democratically elected Republican government of France. Members of the military revolted against it, supported by conservative elements within the country. When an initial military coup failed to win control of the country, led by the military faction, a bloody civil war ensued, fought with great ferocity on both sides. There's two sides. The nationalists, shown here in the brown, led by Francisco Franco, who eventually becomes leader of Spain. They received aid from fascist countries. So fascist countries of Europe, Germany, Italy, gave aid to the nationalist side, to the conservative side, who had a lot of supporters in the Spanish military. Most people on the nationalist side were Roman Catholics, important elements of the military, landowners, and many businessmen. Republicans, shown here in red, which was the democratically elected government of Spain, they received aid from the Soviet Union, which was communist, as well from international brigades composed of volunteers from Europe and the United States. Most people of the Republican side were urban workers, agricultural laborers, and many of the educated middle class. So there's a lot of religious, social distinctions between the two sides. And as I mentioned, the Spanish Civil War is seen by historians as a precursor to World War II. World War II starts once this ends. And what's happening is it's a proxy war. So the fascists are not fighting the communists yet. Like the Nazis and Italians are not fighting the Soviet Union yet. They will eventually. But through the Spanish Civil War, they're fighting each other indirectly, because the Nazis and the Italian fascists are supporting the nationalist side, and the Soviet Union is supporting the Republican side. Just kind of break it down. So the nationalists, they're mostly right-wing groups supported by the church, the army, the monarchists, the Spanish Fascist Party. Republicans, largely left-wing groups, but a real mix of left-leaning groups. You have communists who want to change for violent revolution. You have socialists who want change through central government. You have some anarchists, and you have more centrist, non-left-wing groups such as liberals that want a more modern democracy like Britain or France. So they're kind of unified together to fight against the nationalists. What are Republicans' aims? They want massive change. They want to cut down the power of the army and the church, take land from the rich landowners and redistribute to the poor, give power to the trade unions and workers. What about the nationalists? They want to protect the wealthy and the powerful, keep Spain as it always has been. They're conservative. Keep the Catholic Church important with a role in running schools in the government. They want a large, powerful army, and to keep down the power of workers, trade unions. So two factions with various members involved in each. This is the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. It's part of the latter part of the interwar period, but kind of marks the end of the interwar period and the beginning of World War II after this ends. And there is a they do here you could check out on the Spanish Civil War in this Google Slides presentation. So if you're comparing the two sides, nationalists are more conservative, they're monarchists, they have support from Nazi Germany and Italy, support from the military, support from the Catholic Church. A lot of the people are more wealthy, rural landowners. Republicans are supported by socialists, communists, and even more moderate centrist groups like liberals. Many of them supported democracies. A lot of the working class supported the Republican side, and the Soviet Union also supported the Republican side. So you can't talk about the interwar period without the League of Nations. Now, we talked about the League of Nations a little bit before. That the League of Nations was one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. That after World War I, we need to set up a League of Nations where, rather than it developing into a war, we can have a place where we can diplomatically discuss things. So this is founded in 1919, and it's a result of the Paris Peace Conference. The organization's primary goals included preventing wars through collective security and disarmament and settling international disputes through negotiation and arbitration. Now, you can probably guess this fails, right? Because they have a World War II 20 years later. But this is what its goals are. The diplomatic philosophy behind the League represented a fundamental shift from the preceding 100 years. This is a profound shift. For the previous 100 years, countries were narrowly focused on pursuing their individual self-interested pursuits. Now they're taking, after World War I, more of an internationalist approach, that suggesting we need to work together and negotiate and arbitrate to resolve these different disputes. Now, the League has some problems. The League lacked its own armed force and depended on the victorious First World War allies, France, UK, Italy, Japan, who are permanent members, to enforce its resolutions, keep its economic sanctions, or provide an army when needed. The League of Nations doesn't have its own army. It's going to have to depend on these guys to actually do something if a country violates some international rules. The great powers were often reluctant to do so. Sanctions could hurt League members, so they were reluctant to comply with them. So this organization ultimately lacks teeth, that it doesn't have any way to enforce any sanctions that it may bestow on a belligerent country. And that's why the League of Nations will fail. It doesn't have any real way to stop any aggressive action, much like the United Nations today. So another thing we have to talk about here is this policy. It's known as appeasement. So appeasement is the policy of making concessions to a dictatorship in order to avoid conflict. And appeasement is a method of foreign policy that was used in the interwar period by the Allied powers. They used it whenever they dealt with aggressive nations such as Germany, Italy, Japan, etc. So talk about an agreement known as the Munich Pact. So the Munich Pact was an agreement concluded on March 30th, September 38 by Nazi Germany, the UK, France, and the Kingdom of Italy. It provided a cessation to Germany of the Sudeten German territory of Czechoslovakia. Most of Europe celebrated the agreement because it prevented the war threatened by Adolf Hitler by allowing Nazi Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland. That means acquiring this land. A region of Western Czechoslovakia inhabited by more than 3 million people, mainly German speakers. Hitler announced that it was his last territorial claim in Europe, and the choice seemed to be between war and appeasement. So the Allied powers could have put their foot down and said, no, you cannot have the Sudetenland. This is part of Czechoslovakia, as agreed in the Treaty of Versailles years later, but they didn't. They carried through the policy of appeasement in the 1930s, where rather than go to war, I mean, they had just fought a brutal war 20 years earlier. There wasn't an appetite for another war. They will start to appease Hitler, Mussolini, Imperial Japan. They'll start to give in to them to avoid a war. And why? They should just, like I just said, they do not want to fight another war. Germany is quickly building up an army and was putting pressure on nearby countries in the interwar period. They thought if they allowed Germany to annex a few pieces of land that they could avoid another war. They were wrong. Hitler keeps asking for more and more and more until finally they no longer appease him, and that's going to start World War II. Not everyone supported appeasement. Winston Churchill, who will eventually become Prime Minister of Britain, condemned the Munich Pact. He condemned the policy of appeasement. He said, an appeaser is someone who feeds a crocodile hoping it will eat him last. That eventually you can keep feeding that crocodile. It's going to come for you in the end. So if you take a look at this map, I'll just kind of go over some of the interwar politics and appeasement that took place. So in 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, which they had been banned from doing so by the Treaty of Versailles. So in 1936, they occupy. Now remember, the Nazis had only been in power in Germany for 3 years at this point. They gained power in Germany in 1933. But already in 1936, they are going to occupy the Rhineland. Now, this means they're moving military into this land. They were banned from having any military presence in this area that borders France in the Treaty of Versailles. Then, in 1938, Germany annexes Hitler's homeland of Austria. So Austria became a small independent country after World War I, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up. Austrians are Germans. They speak the German language. They are Germans. Hitler was from Austria, and he considered it an important thing for him to do to reunite Germany and Austria. Now, the only problem with this is that this was banned in the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was not allowed to do this, but Hitler did it. He annexed Austria peacefully. The Allied powers did nothing again. So he's reoccupied the Rhineland, he's annexed Austria, and they've done nothing. They've appeased him. Then, as I mentioned earlier, Germany annexed the Sudetenland. This is the country of Czechoslovakia here. This area here is the Sudetenland. It's primarily German-speaking, but nonetheless was given to Czechoslovakia after World War I. Hitler annexed it. The Allied powers did nothing. Then, in March 1939, he occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, taking over the Czech part and creating a puppet state known as the Protector of Slovakia. Still, the world did nothing. So they are doing all of these expansionist policies in Europe, and they're being appeased. His last step he would do is he would invade Poland to reclaim territory they believe was taken from them at the end of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. At that point, the Allies would draw a line in the sand, and that would start World War II. And I know this is a typo here on the bottom left. That should say September 1939, not 1938. So there's other examples of appeasement. We already talked about these. Remember when Japan invaded Manchuria, which is the northern region in China? China appealed to the League of Nations. The League of Nations insisted that the Japanese forces withdraw from China, but the Japanese continued on with their invasion. The League of Nations had no real teeth. Italy invades Ethiopia in the 1930s. Ethiopia appealed to the League of Nations as well for help. The League placed sanctions on Italy that proved unsuccessful. So the 1930s, countries tried to appease these more aggressive nations such as Italy, Germany, Japan, with the hope of avoiding a war. And it gets to the point where they can no longer do it, and it's going to start the war. So there's a video embedded here on appeasement. It's a great video explaining the whole approach to appeasement in the 1930s. This is just cartoon criticizing appeasement. It's kind of hard to make out. They keep on giving out lollipops to these snakes. Just one more, and then you all go home. Well, they're never going to go home. They're going to keep on asking for more. So it's impossible to appease them. And kind of one of the final acts of the interwar period. I guess this is actually right at the beginning of the war. Right before the war starts, actually. So there's a non-aggressive pact signed between the Germans and the Soviets, which you might think is crazy because communists hate fascists. Well, that's absolutely true. But in August 23rd, 1939, the Soviets and Nazis signed a non-aggression pact, which divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. So they secretly met and agreed that, okay, these areas here are going to be under German influence. These areas will be under Soviet influence. Now, this is not an alliance, but it was basically an agreement to not attack each other and just divide up Europe. However, how they believed was relatively fair anyways. This doesn't last because later in 1941, Germany would invade the Soviet Union without warning through the launching of Operation Barbarossa. But this is one of the last parts of the interwar period where there's a non-aggression pact signed between Germany and the Soviet Union. It's known as the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact. And that leads us to World War II. World War II starts when Germany invades Poland, and the Allied powers will no longer appease Hitler. So that's it for today, guys. We'll talk about World War II next time. There.